And welcome everyone to CGTN Biz Talks, a BRICS Roundtable. I'm Michael Wang here in Beijing. Well, this year the 15th BRICS Summit is held in Johannesburg, South Africa, under the theme BRICS and Africa, Partnership for Mutually Accelerated Growth, Sustainable Development, and Inclusive Multilateralism. Now, the BRICS grouping, of course, includes the developing economy giants of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And together, they make up over 40% of the world's population and over a quarter of the world's economic output. In purchasing power parity terms, BRICS nations are now estimated to contribute more to global growth than even the G7. Chinese President Xi Jinping is attending the BRICS summit and co-chairs a China-Africa Leaders Dialogue with South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. In addition, President Xi will be paying a state visit to South Africa as well. So, let's get more on the 15th BRICS Summit and bring in our panelists. We're joined in the studio by Professor Liu Baocheng, Dean at the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. Online, we're joined by Martin Kingston, who is the Steering Committee Chairman at Business for South Africa. Ksenia Alexandrova is the head of the press office at the Russian-Asian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs. And Ashraf Mohammed Naguib is Director of Corporate Strategy and Development at the Egyptian International Shipping Group. So, welcome to all of you. Professor Liu, I want to start with you on the 15th BRICS Summit and get your take first on the significance of President Xi Jinping attending the BRICS Summit over in Johannesburg. And not only just attending the BRICS Summit, but he's also co-chairing the China-Africa Leaders Dialogue with South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, and also, in addition, paying a state visit to South Africa as well. So talk to us about that first.
Well, the world is in a very rapid transformation in terms of the geopolitical issues, in terms of the geoeconomic issues, and Africa is they're about to stand up to their own feet in order to get more integrated growth. And now, you know, this is a wonderful opportunity for South Africa as one of the BRIC countries to host such sort of events. So therefore, it is really a big gala in the first place for the South-South cooperation. Then we also face, secondly, another big issue of the U.S. dollar issue, because U.S. dollar has been on a high rise, and right now many of those countries are paying higher debt rate to international financial institutions, and also some of them face sanctions from the United States in the SWIFT system. So this is a good opportunity for them to discuss whether they can have an alternative way of payment. And I think more fundamentally is really the economic integration, where trade and investment, how they can be boosted by combining the support of the development bank so that business, the private sector can join the states all together to engage in infrastructure development, to push forward the digital transformation and also infrastructure development.
Yeah, a lot on the agenda. Certainly we're going to get through all of that as well throughout this program in terms of economics, in terms of, I guess, diversifying the global monetary system, because it's interesting to think that the first BRICS Summit was held back in 2009 in the, I guess, right aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2008. And now I think the global economy is once again sort of at a crossroads when it comes to the global monetary system, trade, and rising geopolitics, like you say, Professor Liu. Martin, I want to come to you because, of course, this year's BRICS Summit takes place in your home country, and I want to get your perspective in terms of the significance of this year's summit and President Xi Jinping's state visit to South Africa as well. Martin?
Well, good afternoon, Michael, to you and the other panelists, and indeed the audience. It is a very important defining moment for South Africa. As you said, not only are we having our BRICS counterparts here in South Africa, not only do we have President Xi on a state visit, but there are some 40 heads of state that the President of South Africa, President Ramaphosa, has invited to share in and participate in the proceedings over the next 2 or 3 days, including a very important business summit that is taking place tomorrow. And I think it's a manifestation of both concern that people have about changing geopolitical order, the very different economic speeds at which different parts of the world are now progressing, but also the opportunity, as indeed Professor Liu has said, to harness scope for South-South cooperation, to build on some of the institutions that have already been established, such as, of course, the new Development Bank, and to ensure that Africa, which historically has taken a backseat in terms of its ability to make a real impact economically on the global stage, can demonstrate the contribution both that it can make and the geopolitical importance of the many countries that are actively involved in partnering with other not only BRICS members, but other members of, if you like, multilateral institutions that are going to be here over the coming days.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to get to South-South cooperation in a second, but I think, Professor Liu, I want to come back to you. If we're going to see stronger South-South cooperation, we need to, I guess, see stronger partnerships within the BRICS grouping as well. And President Xi Jinping has said before at previous BRICS summit that I think China envisions high-quality partnerships. He specifically used the term high quality to discuss the partnership and the cooperation that should exist in BRICS. How would you interpret that?
Well, high quality stands on the very solid footing of trust building, because without trust, then people will always incur more of the transaction cost. So second, it must be rule-based. So right now, I think the BRICS needs to strengthen more of the defining rules and norms in order to collaborate, so that friendship is really something that's the beginning, but the realistic synergy based on the rule play is something to give the more predictability to stakeholders, and be it business community, be it the states or financial institution, and even individuals to work together. So right now, I think because we are facing more of the drive for expansion of the BRICS, so therefore, what type of rules, what type of criteria that needs to be deployed so that people can really abide by, instead of simply go there for benefit seeking. And so there must be an equity between the commitment of obligation and also rights. And then the other is that how they can really cope with the new developments, because the BRICS was really built up simply more as a financial facility to help infrastructure development. And right now, the BRICS countries are really having more of the industrial drive, urbanization drive, and more crucially, towards the digital drive. So therefore, how they can really work out more of the technologies, more of the manpower, and also more of the rule building process, so that they can really spearhead into the future.
Yeah, I want to get your take later on that as well in terms of more technology cooperation. And again, I encourage all of our panelists to jump in when you want if another guest raises a point and you want to add on. But Ashraf, I want to come to you because one of the themes of this year's BRICS Summit is, of course, sustainable development. Another theme is accelerating growth on the African continent or in Africa in general. So I want to get your perspective in terms of how BRICS as a mechanism can really promote growth and sustainable development in Africa. Ashraf?
Well, I mean, it's really interesting because when we're looking at something like BRICS and then come and compare it, and I want to say just to analyze what's happening in Africa, but to compare BRICS with Africa. I mean, Africa is an incredible continent with tremendous amount of growth and a tremendous amount of potential that can really, how can I say, sway the way things are going in the global economy. The only problem with Africa is that we have, until now, not really solidified our relationships in terms of intra-African trade, economic development, actual cooperation, cross-border cooperation. And this is going to be very important for us, looking towards not just BRICS. One of the things that I believe Africa should be doing is not only looking to the east or to the west, or to the north, but really looking within the continent itself and see what the true potential is and how we can work together. Because that it's on its own, I mean, when we look at what's happening with BRICS and the concept of this expansion that's going on, and we're talking about 40% of the world's population, with the expansion of BRICS, then we're really at a time when we need global unity, are having a global disconnect. And I think Africa is going to play a very major role in balancing this new world order, if we're looking to call it that.
Yeah. Martin, how do you think the BRICS mechanism can better unleash the potential of Africa? We're talking about a continent that has over 1.4 billion people, a very young continent as well. And I just always feel there's so much potential to be unleashed in terms of Africa when it comes to development, when it comes to growth, in terms of what Africa can contribute to the world. So how do you think BRICS, especially an expanded BRICS, Martin, can really help to contribute to Africa's growth and development?
Well, obviously, it provides, Michael, a very significant marketplace, both in terms of investment and trade partners and relations. But I'd like to go back, if I may, first to what Ashraf was saying. Now, in the first instance, I believe that it's critically important that as a continent, Africa gets its own act together, that it's able to speak in unity, that it's got common policies and objectives, that it understands what are its priorities as a continent on a continental basis. Because, of course, we need to distinguish between bilateral relationships between individual countries and continental relationships, or relationships between blocs, both investment, trading, and indeed geopolitical blocs. I'm sure we'll come on to that in a moment. And part of getting one's house in order is making sure that we have the right systems, processes, governance structures, that we have the right funding mechanisms available either internally or that we can access externally, the very rules-based approach that Professor Liu was actually referring to earlier on in this conversation. Now, my own view is that there is tremendous opportunity, both bilaterally and continentally, between individual countries in Africa, South Africa being one, of course, but the continent more broadly, as well as some of its BRICS counterparts. When we start talking about expanding, whether it's to 40 or a smaller number of countries, we need to think about, the enormous imposition that is in terms of making sure that we've got an appropriate level of alignment. The bigger problem about expansion is that we default generally to the lowest common denominator. We're not able to drive through key issues, whether that be, for example, on the ocean economy, whether that be on climate change or the just transition, which are critical, or indeed, the role of cities and infrastructure, as we were talking about earlier, in driving economic growth and activity. And as I was saying earlier on, one of the challenges that Africa has had is that it has not achieved its theoretical potential. There's absolutely no doubt, not only that BRICS counterparts, but other countries that we're talking about can play a very significant role. Fundamentally, it comes down to bilateral trade and investment flows, as I said, opening up capital markets to be able to energize the opportunity and the potential that exists.
Right. Quick follow-up, Martin, then. In terms of BRICS, as a framework, can it help to, like you said, help Africa, I guess, get its act together? Can it be a more unifying force than some of the other maybe organizations that we see?
Absolutely, and I think that the new development bank is an absolutely perfect example of that, which has mobilized very significant sums of capital, not just, by the way, from BRICS members, but from other countries as well, and has dispersed them not only just to BRICS beneficiaries, but to other countries, and has imposed very significant and appropriate rules and conditions on the loans that have been extended. Only last week raised a very significant facility actually in the South African market. It's an example of a very strong and established BRICS-based institution now, BRIC-based, of course, in Shanghai with representation in South Africa, which can play a critical role in unlocking the potential for many countries. One of the focus areas of the discussions that are taking place this week, over the last 2 days and over the coming 2 days, will be the transfer of experience, skills, and technology, making sure that we've got appropriate representation, not just from the BRICS countries, but from other countries as well. And when I say representation in the business community, to share experience, to forge relationships and allegiances, and build on that accordingly.
And speaking of representation, Ksenia, I want to come to you because another one of the themes of this year's BRICS Summit is about inclusive multilateralism. And I want to get your perspective in terms of how the BRICS can really promote inclusive multilateralism. Because if you want multilateralism to be inclusive as part of the theme, it sort of, I guess, tells the world that perhaps developing countries didn't feel as included as they say, that their voice is not as represented as they should in the global order right now. What do you think, Ksenia?
I think the most important question in this field is the expansion of BRICS. And we would recommend perceiving the expansion of BRICS with restrained optimism, because let me remind you that the expansion of BRICS is not welcomed by all members now, and not all candidates meet the requirements already for full membership. Furthermore, the expansion of BRICS core will significantly complicate the consensus achievement. And regarding this, I would note that the BRICS Plus and BRICS Outreach formats, both, by the way, launched on the initiative of China in 2022, are really good options. And they are not only representatives of the core, the organization can work, but also candidates, and in general, any countries interested in cooperation. I think this format is extremely promising. It allows us to organize cooperation in those areas that are really interesting to non-BRICS countries without permanent membership. And I think the potential of cooperation within the framework of BRICS is much broader than just that in the field of economy. You can look at the BRICS structure and estimate the number of committees, councils, and other bodies within which cooperation is carried out. This is a cultural, scientific, and technical tracks, medicine, security issues in various fields, and much more. BRICS is not only about the economy. BRICS is about sustainable and diverse development. I think that sometimes BRICS lacks a healthy PR to form a correct idea about themselves. But of course, the organization will have an impact on regional growth and economic ties, and the meaning of its existence and its work is much deeper.
Absolutely. Professor Liu, I want to come to you and talk about how BRICS maybe functions as a coordination mechanism. 15 summits on. The first one was actually held in Russia. Now we're back in South Africa again. So 15 summits later, how would you evaluate BRICS as a mechanism for coordination to really tackle some of the common challenges that these 5 nations have?
Well, the global order was set forth after the Second World War by the countries led by the United States in the Western one, and now the rise of the BRICS is really, it's not really a rebellion, if not a rebellion, but rather a complement to the loopholes of the global order, so that it bears a huge significance in the global landscape. And right now, BRICS has been evolving more from a financial facility, be it the development bank and also the contingency reserve. Now they are expanding their horizon into a multifaceted areas of cooperation. And now the 2 issues are really required to go further. One is that how the BRICS can be more institutionalized as a organization with the right type of rule play, and also how they can really be set up not only the platform, but more as an institution with more of the secretariat and even different type of working committees, so that they can drive home a number of issues instead of ministers meeting once a year. And state leaders are really setting the guideline, but more of the implementation needs to be handled by task forces. And the other is that we can see that the BRICS Bank has been very instrumental in doing the sustainable projects related with infrastructure. And so far, if you look at the list, India is so far the biggest beneficiary. So how this, the financial institution can be expanded to be more inclusive in terms of the investment, and also in terms of the its output in supporting the energy transformation, in supporting even gender equity and the green production, and also digital transformation. So there's a lot more to do on this end.
Yeah.
And on the other end, how those countries who are ready to join this the BRICS, how they can be more committed to play by the role and also to continually to deal with the contribution with this organization, not because of something, because BRICS is a matter of expediency, and right now because I'm facing a tough time with the U.S. dollars or with the U.S. Hegemony, and then there needs to be a long commitment. And the other is that we do see a huge potential and hope going on in Africa. As a matter of fact, of course, they are a mainstay of the Belt and Road program for China, and also the new free trade agreement, across the entire African continent, can also provide more of the institutionalized, tangible opportunities for global investors. Of course, Chinese business communities are also eager to jump on board.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, trade between China and Africa, what, about $282 billion last year. China is Africa's largest trading partner now for 14 some odd years. You mentioned the new development bank. We're going to come back to that as well, but just for our audience, you don't have to be a member of BRICS to be a member of the NDB, right? Because
that's right.
We have now Egypt as part of the NDB. We have the UAE.
United Arab Emirates, yes.
Bangladesh, I think, and also Uruguay.
Yeah.
And I'm expecting, I guess we're all expecting more countries to join the new
because
development
it is highly inclusive, and that is why it's attractive points. What I really wanted to stress is that they need a more extended rules to play.
Yeah. We'll probably get that as we see more integration, because Ksenia was talking about, and you were mentioning as well, this is not just about the economy and about finance. We're seeing more people-to-people exchanges, right? Culture exchanges, film, youth, media cooperation. Sometimes we have 100 meetings throughout the year when it comes to the BRICS. Oftentimes we only focus on the BRICS summit, but there's a lot of meetings.
Yeah, several years ago, actually, I was leading a group to have dialogue in Johannesburg with the representatives from 12 countries, because we were working with the Institute of Ethics within the South Africa to handle a survey. And the survey result was not really very promising. And then after this dialogue, people found that communication is so much more important. And therefore, we visited a number of Chinese invested companies over there, like the First Auto Company, etc. The employees are very happy, and also some of the roads China was building over there, and the business community relationship are being further enhanced. And now the recent survey, actually, over the perception of the Chinese investment from Africa has far more improved because of the constant interaction and also tangible contribution Chinese people have already delivered.
Yeah, I think building the infrastructure first, or supporting Africa, working in partnership with Africa to build out the infrastructure network, can definitely support Africa's growth and development as well.
Yeah, because they go two things. One is industrialization, the other is urbanization. And this is really something they are heading for, modernization. So for that, they need infrastructure and they need energy as the forefront the requirements in order to boost the industrialization and urbanization.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to talk about what BRICS means for South Africa and what BRICS means for Russia in just a second. But Ashraf, I want to come to you because we were talking about infrastructure. That's important, right? Energy is important. But the sharing of technical expertise, the diffusion of technology, I think is super important. We talk about generative AI every single day now, but a lot of people, I guess, still in the developing world, they need to worry about putting food on the table. They need to worry about maybe shelter and clothes, and how can technology support that perhaps, right? Especially developing economy as they go through their own green transition. So how do you see BRICS really helping to diffuse technology, share technology, and we see more innovation cooperation among developing economies through BRICS? What are your thoughts on that?
There's no doubt that this is a global theme per se, because anyone that is not taking that train is going to be left behind. But that being said, and as per your introduction, it is a matter of maturity and sophistication of each of these individual economies, and I talk about Egypt specifically, where we have come out of two revolutions in the past decade. where we have a very how can I say, increase in large population growth, not as big as China and India and some of the other countries of the BRICS, but we are way up there as well, about 2.7% population growth. There's a tremendous need for infrastructure. Egypt, for the past probably 60 to 70 years, has neglected investing and building into infrastructure, and this is what the recent government and the recent leadership has been doing over the past probably 7 years. And I'd say that there has been a tremendous amount of support, specifically from China and other BRICS countries, but more specifically from China, in not the transformation of expertise simply in technology and innovation, but expertise on infrastructure building. And this is seen throughout Egypt, that the Chinese government has been a tremendous support in rebuilding a lot of the infrastructure in Egypt and building new infrastructure. We have almost about 26 new cities that have been built, and a lot of that expertise is coming from China. So we build faster, we build bigger, we build more efficiently, and I think that is extremely important. The other thing that is as well a transfer of expertise in a sense, not so much technology, is on the trade part, how we're building the infrastructure of our ports, how we're building the infrastructure of our trade. So again, I think what's interesting is, Egypt has great bilateral relationships with the individual countries of the BRICS. And we would consider our relationship with China as being strategic, our relationship with India as being strategic. We're seeing tremendous amount of investment, private sector investments in Egypt by these two countries in a lot of manufacturing, distribution, transfer of knowledge, expertise. So I think eventually what we're looking at, again, in even the concept of the expansion of BRICS, is where do we fit in terms of sophistication, maturity, and the requirements, our two-day requirements, which, like you were saying, we've got people that need to work. We're not at that point where we're going into robotics and AI and automation. On the contrary, we need to create more jobs. We need to create more manufacturing. We need to create more trade. And I think this is why BRICS for us is extremely interesting, because these countries have gone through these experiences since it was termed BRIC 22 years ago, and eventually formulated into this wonderful gathering and group.
Yeah. Well, there is a new Industrial Revolution Center set up in Xiamen. This was mentioned by President Xi back in the 9th BRICS Summit, if I remember, in 2017, and officially set up in 2020. And this new Industrial Revolution Centers train now some 865,000 people from developing countries, and hopefully that expertise can be brought back and we can see, for example, more manufacturing investment in developing economies as well. Martin, I want to come to you and get your thoughts in terms of what BRICS means for South Africa's development, for, I guess, more investment in the higher end manufacturing technology sectors. We were reading just before the BRICS Summit is going to take place this week that there is solar panel cooperation between China and South Africa to try and maybe stem sort of the energy shortages that we see in your country right now. What are your thoughts, Martin?
Well, you've actually raised one of the key issues that bedevils the real scope for economic growth here in South Africa. As many of your viewers will know, despite our potential, at the moment we've got a GDP growth of actually less than 1%. We have not come out of the, if you like, pandemic ramifications of contraction in growth as a consequence of lockdown, and obviously the damage that the pandemic caused to all economies around the world. We have significant levels of unemployment. 44% of our working age population is unemployed. In fact, over 60% of our youth are unemployed. And the only way that we're going to drive inclusive growth and indeed address the employment challenges are in a couple of areas. One is in infrastructure development. So I'd like to go back to that for a moment, if I may. The area of energy, we have what we call load shedding or power cuts on a daily basis. We have had over a year. So that's, if you like, a problem because we haven't had the right investment in supply. Now a major shift to scope for private sector investment in supply, including, of course, solar panels, but not just. So that area you mentioned is absolutely critical in transportation, rail, road, and port, in both areas where China has and can play a very significant role, both as a provider of goods and equipment, but also in the rehabilitation and maintenance of existing assets. The third is water. We're actually a water scarce country, and yet all of this, when we have, in fact, the largest stock, if you like, of mineral resources in the world, needs to be appropriately exploited, and most importantly, Michael, not just mined, but it needs to be beneficiated. So this idea of localization, of making sure that we take our natural resources, we beneficiate them in the country, and we add value here before we export them, both to our neighbors in Africa, but to our BRICS counterparts as well as globally, is an absolutely key focus of attention. In fact, it's a subject of discussion during this week's meetings, both at, if you like, head of state level, as well as at a business level. Now, ultimately, again, as Ashraf has said, this needs to be done on a bilateral basis. We can have a conversation about a multilateral institution facilitating those conversations, but investment and trade is not done multilaterally. Investment and trade is done bilaterally, of course, between the private and the public sector, sometimes generally between the private sector and the private sector, depending upon the countries concerned. But it can be facilitated and underpinned by institutions such as BRICS, which is where I attach such significance, not just in the provision of finance, as we've discussed in the context of the new development bank, but critically in various cultural exchanges, as you have mentioned, in making sure that we're able to ensure that there is a real learnings that are exchanged between countries, companies, sectors concerned. Much of that taking place, workshops that are taking place this week, and indeed have taken place, the 100-odd meetings that you've talked about over the past year. Much of that is about the exchange of knowledge, information, developing relationships, forging an understanding of where counterparties can add value. Now, my own narrow interest is that South Africa can take advantage of that, can leverage on the interest that is being demonstrated in South Africa, not just this week, but more broadly as one of the 2 or 3 largest economies in the continent alongside Egypt and Nigeria, that we can drive continental growth, also on an integrated basis, but also, and I know that you'll come to this, that it can play a role more broadly on the geopolitical stage, because we have to understand and appreciate that what is taking place globally now is having a very direct impact, a very negative direct impact, I have to say, on the economies of many of the countries in Africa. And once again, having a forum where that can be discussed in the current environment is absolutely essential.
Yeah, that's a big topic. We have to talk about that, leave some time to talk about that in a second. But Ksenia, I want to come to you and get your overall view in terms of what BRICS has meant for Russia. Because again, the first BRICS summit back in 2009, that was held in Ekaterinburg, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, BRICS means a lot to Russia. And as you know, we are one of the main countries that really pushes that organization. But as you know, we have many political changes during past years, and of course, it's an issue of what we can do now. Last year, many companies left Russian market, and now we have that empty space that needs to be occupied, including factories that have everything ready to work. And it's really a matter of joint enterprises, joint companies, joint work to make it all happen. We promote cooperation between Russian and foreign companies in this field. For partners from the BRICS countries, membership in the Russian Asian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs is actually a quality mark, a certain guarantee of the reliability of the partner. And talking about the new development bank that we've already mentioned several times, I want to note that it was created with a capital of, if I remember correctly, $100 billion in 2014 to invest in infrastructure projects. And because of the sanctions, the organization is not considering new projects in Russia yet. So there are questions concerning investments that are still on pause, and that's a question that we have to solve now as well.
Hmm. Yeah, but again, I think BRICS is definitely, it's a long-term mechanism. So I guess long-term we'll
Yes.
see what Russia's role will be in BRICS. Speaking of Russia, Ksenia, do you have any thoughts in terms of Russia's contribution to Africa? What Russia has contributed throughout, I guess, the past decade to Africa's development?
I don't know exactly the figures, but I guess that we made a lot within the cultural impact, the meetings between the leaders of the countries. I also think that we've helped financially and within the transferring of technologies to help developing different projects and, as we've already mentioned, green energy projects. As well, we are holding many events together, business events where youth and different businessmen, entrepreneurs can cooperate and meet each other. And I think Russia is one of the moderators in this discussion.
Mm.
I think so.
In terms of facilitating investment and market access, Ksenia, through BRICS, what do you see on that front?
I don't really know the figures, as I've already mentioned, but I guess Russian role is quite important, and our union as an organization.
I meant overall, Ksenia, not just to Africa, but BRICS in general in terms of its ability to facilitate market access and investment.
I think that its ability is quite good, and only our organization, on the Russian Asian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, we've already done quite a lot. In over the 13 years of our work, we have attracted about $820 million of investments and increased trade turnover between Russia and Asian countries by more than $1 billion. So these figures mostly relate to the Asian BRICS countries.
Mm.
So
Okay.
in general, facilitating access to investments and mutual access to markets is rather the work of national governments. But we can do many things within BRICS framework as well.
Yeah. Well, that framework might expand. Let's talk about BRICS expansion, because that is a huge topic. Professor Liu, I want to come to you on this, because the South African ambassador to BRICS was reporting that we've got, over 40 countries either directly or indirectly expressing interest to join BRICS. We've seen many large developing economies. We were talking about this before the program, the likes of, for example, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Iran, Argentina, all expressing interest to join. And I want to get your take in terms of what an expanded BRICS means for, I guess, a multipolar world, but also the attractiveness of this organization with so many large developing economies and smaller emerging and developing economies clamoring to join as well.
Well, I think a number of signs, particularly in terms of regional and sectorial institutions on a multilateral basis, are really a reflection of the dissatisfaction of those participating members with the status quo, that how the world economy and how the world geopolitics are run. And the rise of the BRICS is one of them to answer some of the predicament the current international institutions are facing. So first, it is something that is there to serve as alternative to the global financial institutions like IMF and ADB, etc., and that really complement the deficiency of finance in infrastructure development. So that was the starting point. Second, more of the South countries are dissatisfied with the relationship that is being carved and dominated by the Northern world, where they realize the Northern world are unable to deliver the existing commitment, not to mention about to unearth or unlock their potential. So Africa should be really a land of promise, And now, actually, through my interview with a number of officials from the northern countries, they still consider Africa is a begging bowl instead of a land of promise. So the conception for them to have to engage more of the self-sufficiency and integrity with more of those developing countries. And now the BRICS, the existing BRIC members, are really the leaders in that regard. They have experience, they have the economic might, and also they have the strong will from the business community to get engaged. Now with the expansion of those members, my advice is that we need to clarify the rule to play before we just go for explosive expansion, because it is something by unanimous agreement within the 5 countries, you can really make a decision. But if you have 30 or 40 countries that are there, you need to have a very clear charter. You need to have a working mechanism, and also you also need to something that can benchmark with WTO, some sort of arbitration mechanism if certain disputes really arise. So therefore, another advice is that the participant members should also do a better homework in order to get ready. For example, when China was really getting ready to join some of the international organizations like WTO, like RCEP, and now also getting prepared for CPTPP, is that they need also to streamline their domestic policies so that they can really get more of the synergy and integrity with the common rule that people can play. It's not only it should not really be simply based on a handshake of friendship.
Right. So I guess this summit definitely will talk about the criteria for membership, right?
Yes.
Because like you mentioned, right now it operates by consensus, 5 countries, but as the group continues to expand, there will be more voices into this grouping, and we're going to see how this mechanism, I guess, functions with more members.
Exactly.
Ashraf, I want to get your take on this, because Egypt has now formally applied to join the BRICS grouping, and if you want to follow up on any of Professor Liu's thoughts, please welcome to share your thoughts on that with us as well. And why do you think Egypt wants to join the BRICS?
Well, one of the interesting things is we are now part of the new development bank. And I think that was a priority to Egypt even before officially trying to become part of the BRICS as a group. The new development bank is very important to Egypt at this point, and not an exclusive direction of access to finance, but again, it is a more options that we have on the table for Egypt to be able to have access to finance. And the new development bank gives us this, how can I say, flexibility to be able to get faster access to finance, probably larger access to finance, more efficient, with less conditionalities. But that does not negate the fact that we still do access finance from other international organizations like the IMF, like the African Development Bank, like the African Import-Export Bank, and a lot of other institutions that have been, how can I say, playing a very important role in financing the future of Egypt. That being said, BRICS is extremely important, and again, because we have quite considerable trade with at least the eastern part of the BRICS countries, such as India, such as China, and such as Russia, not so much with South Africa and Brazil, where we still need to explore the potential of growth there. But this is very important for us. And one of the major issues that Egypt faces, as a lot of other countries, but more specifically Egypt, when it comes to this bilateral and multilateral trade with that part of the world, is accessibility to foreign currency. And that hinders a lot of the business that we're trying to do together. And BRICS opens up a very interesting option, and which allows us to be able to move a little bit further from the requirements of accessibility to foreign currency, such as the US dollar or the euro, and be able to do business with our own currencies. And this is vital and extremely important, because we do need to grow our exports. The Egyptian president had put down a directive 2 years ago saying that Egypt needs to grow its exports to $100 billion. And that will not be able to be done because we still suffer from a trade deficit, and accessibility to foreign currency is one of the key issues that will help us in the process of the supply chain. And be able to help Egyptian manufacturers, enhance their capabilities and their quality and their accessibility to other markets. Now, our problem isn't accessibility to markets because we're part of the African Union. We have the Qualified Industrial Zones Agreement with the United States. We're part of the Association Agreement. We've got access to billions of people in consumer markets around the world. The problem is, how do you create that mechanism? How do you create that sophistication of an economy where you're able to actually take advantage of that very large access that we have? So BRICS puts on the table an option that Egypt, at this very particular point, and maybe not just Egypt, a lot of other countries really require for our way forward for our development and growth. And I think the African continent is the same, because if Martin would agree with me on this, what China has done for Asia, what India has done for Asia, what a country even like Singapore has done for Asia is something that we're trying to see and emulate in a sense. Who is the China of Africa? Who is the India of Africa? Who is the Singapore of Africa? And I think collectively as African countries, we suffer from the same problems. We know that we are not reaching our full potential. And something like BRICS, under the collective consciousness of African nations, can be extremely important. And we should ask ourselves this question. It's not what BRICS will do for Africa, but what a collective Africa might be able to do for BRICS.
Yeah, well, actually, that was one of my questions in terms of what stronger African engagement can mean for BRICS, but I felt like throughout the entire conversation, all of our panelists have already addressed that quite well. And I think Africa is Africa, right? Egypt can be Africa. South Africa is Africa. Nigeria, certainly. And just thinking about Egypt, I feel, at the crossroads of both Asia and Europe and, of course, Africa. So geographically speaking, the potential of Egypt is absolutely massive, already a $480 billion economy. And if it officially does join BRICS, hopefully we can see more synergies that can help Egypt develop as well. Martin, I want to come to you. So again, feel free to pick up on any thoughts that our other guests have spoken about. But just in terms of what BRICS means for amplifying the voice of the global South, what do you think that means, especially for an expanded BRICS?
Well, as I indicated before, and we've touched on it already, Michael, we are living in a very complex set of global geopolitical and actually economic circumstances. There's nothing that happens in the United States that doesn't impact upon the rest of the world, and in particular, but not only Africa, equally China, equally the sort of conflicts that we're seeing around the world, not just, but particularly, obviously, between Russia and the Ukraine. And having a strong voice, which is actually an independent voice, acts, I think, both as an important counterweight in those discussions, but also demonstrates that not only is there strength in numbers, but that there's alignment outside of a particular sort of, if you like, geopolitical axis. Now, that is important because many countries, including South Africa, for example, are not prepared to be defined by being associated with a particular bloc. Not a political bloc, not an economic bloc. They advocate and encourage participation, trade, investment, and indeed political relations across a vast spectrum of sort of political and other ideologies. And I think that is something that defines South Africa as it emerged from apartheid 30 years ago into its current democratic order. Along with that, obviously, it's had to open up its barriers. We'll all be very familiar with the fact that South Africa was on the receiving end of very punitive sanctions for a long time prior to 1994. It's opened up its capital markets, it's opened up its trading relationships, again, across the world. But I think we acknowledge equally, not only that we must pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, but that actually there is a strength in cooperation and indeed collaboration, both with African countries as well as with other like-minded countries, of which the BRICS countries are a very good example in terms of forging those relationships. We should remember, of course, that if we go back to the genesis of BRICS, it wasn't a geopolitical structure at all. It was purely an economic construct, in fact, an economic construct defined by James O'Neill, now Lord O'Neill, then an economist at Goldman Sachs. We've moved a very long way from the genesis of the concept. So now we're trying to define, and that for me is very important, we're trying to define what is the purpose, not only of BRICS as it is, but of a potentially enlarged BRICS. And I would agree with the comments that have been made before, which is that if we can create an environment where we can mobilize greater capital, where we can ensure that skills and capabilities are transferred as seamlessly as possible, without, by the way, creating an institution for the sake of creating an institution, because we need to understand just how much time and effort is taken to put these institutions in place on the one hand, and to make sure, as indeed Professor Liu has said, that they align with pre-existing institutions. We all need to make sure that we've got an appropriate forum for engagement and cooperation. And there is an existing set of rules that we need to respect, whether it is the WTO, which has already been talked about, or other structures. So we need to be mindful of that when we try and actually build on what we already have, which, as I said, was primarily an economic structure to facilitate and catalyze greater levels of cooperation than we had enjoyed before on a purely bilateral basis. And I think we would all advocate that. We would all advocate that, particularly for a continent, in the case of Africa, that is the most impoverished in the world, and yet one which has enormous, probably untapped potential, and where existing and future partners can play a role, a hand, in supporting that trajectory.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to clarify for our audience, Professor Liu, I want to come to you, because Martin was talking about South Africa not wanting to associate with a particular bloc. We talk about BRICS amplifying the voices of the global South and promoting South-South cooperation, but that doesn't mean that the global South is excluding North-South cooperation, right? Just want to make that clear.
Yeah, I think it is crystal clear, because the Northern world thought the Southern world is really dependent on their power, and hence the subject of manipulation. And they also, some of them may also have a sense of redemption after the long history of colonialism. But from my research, I do not see that many of those northern countries really see a huge potential. Normally, they would say, okay, you China, or you India or Singapore, you do it, you go and develop Africa, good luck. So therefore, now it is really a strong showcase that they can together first to be able to create their own institutions and the financial platform to work on their own. And two is that it is really inclusive. It's not only inclusive for all the South members, but also inclusive of also the Northern members, and also inclusive of all business communities, to support. I think now for NDB to really to provide the for the BRICS Bank to really to provide more of the energizing power. We do need more capitalization from different communities, including that of the Northern world. And then also that there also needs to be a further integration within the existing and also potential members, again based on the rules. And I think more realistically is that all the members really need to care about some of their homework. First, political stability, and social security, then policy consistency. So these are really the things that particularly many African countries need to get engaged, because the interaction with many of the Chinese companies investing over there, and they do really want to see something like this so that they can beef up their investment and also leave the profit to reinvest in a particular project. Yeah. But if they do not really feel the certainty of moving ahead in that continent, and therefore they will make very short-term decisions.
Yeah. We've mentioned the new development bank several times now. I want to talk about the issue of local currencies in just a second. But Ksenia, I want to come to you and get your take in terms of what an expanded BRICS could potentially mean for regional growth and what it could mean for new business opportunities for your organization.
The expansion of BRICS is connected to one of the major concepts of BRICS. It's multipolar world, as you know, and one of the main questions of the upcoming summit is a greater use of local currencies, as you've mentioned, and even the possibility of a BRICS currency, which may have the potential to challenge the dominance of the US dollar. But we have to mention that any expansion of the BRICS grouping could determine the speed with which the bloc adopts commercial and financial systems and the use of the local currencies as well. However, as you know, in terms of our organization, we already have some trade relations with use of yuans and rubles, and I think for our union, the expansion of BRICS will be a very good option to promote our abilities in the region and globally.
Yeah.
I think now that's more of a wish to really to have a common currency. Right now you can really get engaged in some of the currency swap, on the bilateral basis or maximum on trilateral basis.
Local currencies.
Yeah, on local currencies. So to have really a common currency, it's really a far way to go because even the Eurozone is not fully consolidated. And now that even now within the 5 existing BRIC countries, they do not, many of them do not really have their own financial stability and do not really have their own transparent fiscal budget, and not to mention about the full convertibility of the currencies. So it is really a goal that we move forward, but that is why it is not really a common currency. It's not really on the agenda for this summit. So this is something that you can think about, but it's unrealistic even in the foreseeable future.
You would need a fiscal union, you would need a banking union, for example, you need a customs union, I think, to really think about a common currency. But local currencies, I think, would be something that BRICS
That
are
is true.
interested in.
I think
Right,
I give you one
yeah.
anecdote is that when I was buying a souvenir on the roadside in Johannesburg, and I show in my wallet the green money and there's red money, and then that guy just I said, green money is not really. I like the red money, so
Which
I
is
paid
the Chinese yuan.
Yeah, I paid the Chinese yuan over there. So
Okay.
that really gave me a happy surprise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the new development bank, I think the goal is to reach about 30% in local currency lending by 2026. So this could become a defining feature of BRICS once it's expanded as more.
Yeah, so that's the
currency
BRICS
use.
rule of the BRICS, I should say.
Right.
Yeah.
Ashraf, do you have anything to add on this in terms of what do you think the significance will be if we see more local currency being done among the BRICS nations?
Well, as I had mentioned before, obviously it will have a tremendous amount of, how can we say, positive impact on specifically for Egypt and probably a lot of other countries on the way that we trade. And this will be very important in the future and will be significant. If we're talking about a common currency per se, and I know that this is going to be a long shot, the problem is, I mean, countries like Egypt, like you had mentioned before, and with our geographic positioning and how can I say, our non-exclusivity of being part of one part of the world or the other. There has been talk about the common currency between the Arab world. There has been talk of a common currency in Africa. There's been, I mean, that has come up over and over again, and we've seen that regulatorily to be able to put together something that we use as a common currency that negates these sovereign currencies is going to be a very, very difficult task. And I think what BRICS needs to focus on right now, and the new development bank needs to focus on right now, is how can we increase the amount and volume of trade that we're doing together in terms of our own currencies, and at the same time on how the new development bank will be able to facilitate its lending within that continent. And that being said, and let me play devil's advocate here, because again, this is in the best benefit of Egypt and a lot of other countries for us to be able to trade in our own currencies. But would that have been the same if Egypt has doesn't have a trade deficit and actually is much stronger on its exports than it is right now, rather than being a net importer? Would we have been walking down the same road, the same direction? So there's a lot of things that we need to think about when it comes to that. But I think it's a very positive step that at least we're able to relieve some of the pressure of the requirements of having foreign currency reserves, specifically on the dollar, and be able to deal with our trade partners at a different level.
Yeah. Martin, I mean, when it comes to local currencies, a lot has been said about this BRICS summit. Would you say, I mean, there's this term called de-dollarization that's constantly being thrown around, I guess, in the media these days. But would you say it's more about de-dollarization, or is it more about trying to make the global financial system fairer, more inclusive, more representative of the developing economies when the BRICS talk about local currencies?
Absolutely, the way that I like to think.
Martin, how about you go first, and Ashraf, add on to what Martin said.
Yeah. I'm not sure there's a distinction between the two. I think there's certainly a move away from de-dollarization, exactly as you've said, and that goes hand in glove with finding a more equitable, more appropriate currency that is reflective of flows that take place. Having said that, we've seen a very significant experience an experiment, I have to say, in the European Union. When Britain joined the EU, now of course it's left, it did not become part of the Eurozone for reasons that we'll all be familiar with. I think it's a project too far, to be perfectly honest, Michael. I think that there are many ways in which we can strengthen our individual currencies and our economies through global participation. We need to be very sensitive in the current environment of importing both currency risk, sort of inflation risk, interest rate risk, and at the moment those are huge challenges on a global basis. It's not as though we can live isolated from one another, but I would rather that we have prudent conservative projects in terms of how we take the BRICS project forward than what I consider to be an extremely ambitious and probably unachievable project in even the long term of a BRICS currency, despite the aspirations that you refer to and some of the geopolitical drivers that underpin that view, would be my own assessment. I think we need to be very focused, very disciplined on how we take what we've got and we build on it pragmatically with the resources that we have at our disposal, with the primary focus being to ensure that we can actually shore up, we can reinforce the economic potential of those countries that are emerging into the sunlight but still have a long way to go. Many of them, I'm afraid, are currently in Africa.
Right. And Ashraf, you had some thoughts on this as well. I want to get your thoughts on this also, because again, 2009, that was the first BRICS summit. And when we talk about local currencies, it was that time where we had the financial distress in advanced economies, and then that spilled over to the developing world. Now, again, it's sort of the opposite, where it's super high interest rates in very short span of time. And that's also, again, spilling over to the developing world in terms of perhaps capital outflows. So your thoughts?
Well, again, in my opinion, it's by principle. I want to put aside the political aspect of it and really look at the logical aspect of it. I mean, when you diversify dependency, then you diversify your risk as well, and you can spread that. And we've seen that since 2008, and we've seen a lot of these, economic fiscal cycles going through that have been extremely devastating for countries like Egypt and other developing nations. And I think it's just very logical as we move forward. And we, the globe lives in adversity per se. I mean, we've been through one crisis and the other, and we're trying to create this unification, and hence the dependency on one currency, whether it be the dollar or what other name that we can put to it. It is about time that we have, as you mentioned, more fair basis of how we trade together and options. I mean, we have to leave ourselves with different options. And I think what BRICS is trying to put on the table is to give options to countries like Egypt and South Africa and other developing nations to spread the risk per se and be able to maneuver a little bit with flexibility and less dependency.
Yeah. Again, I think it's about diversification of the global monetary system, having that other option available if there is financial distress that we see in the world. Professor Liu, I want to come to you because President Xi Jinping has now published an article in South African media, and he spoke at length about 4 points, I guess, that there should be more cooperation between China and South Africa when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to manufacturing, when it comes to new energy, and also to really unleash the potential of the African continent as well. Martin, I want to get your thoughts on this, also about this published article in South African media, but your thoughts first, Professor Liu, on this, on these 4 areas.
Well, China has been exporting actually more than 70% of all the new energy apparatuses, be it solar panels and other type of gadgets, to all over the world. So Africa is really one of the very important target, but they have special conditions in terms of the climate change issues because they do not have very powerful power grids. So actually, that really gives China a great advantage by exporting different size of solar panels over there, and some of the even the villages can really fully utilize the small ones that normally bigger businesses do not really see a profit from which. So, and they've been doing really extremely successful. And for the industrialization, because China's experience over the past 40 years and more is that you need to build the road in order to get people, goods, and technology get connected before you can really develop the economy. So this experience is directly transferred and also being welcomed by Africa. And in terms of Africa, China is really having a very tough time with all the land, for growing grains. So many of the Chinese businesses, they found that there are fertile land in Africa to grow not only the agro business, cash crops, and even the Chinese herbal medicines. So they can harvest. So this is something that's very important. Now China is also getting engaged in the rural revitalization program. We can really directly transfer our experience by combining the mechanization and digital technology and also the e-commerce together to grow the agricultural business. So this is, and for industrialization, energy. So without which nobody really can really talk about this. So China is really a realistic one. We committed not really to to provide the coal burning, the power generators, but with more of the new energies and also more with the hydropower we developed in many of the African countries. That really gave people a huge impetus to invest. It's not only from China, but investors from all over the world, so that they have access to power, and so for their industrial manufacturing over there. And then also that when China is also engaged in the reshaping of the supply chain, the repositioning itself, many of the more of the labor-intensive operations are also being reallocated to Africa, and the businesses can really revive their life cycle of their product and service, and also people locally to get more decent jobs.
Yeah. Martin, I want to come to you because this article signed by President Xi Jinping in the South African media describing the China-South Africa relationship as the golden age of China-South Africa relations. Your thoughts in terms of what President Xi has proposed in these areas of focus: agriculture, manufacturing, for example, new energy, unleashing the potential of Africa, and also describing China-South Africa relations as a golden age. Martin?
Well, there's no doubt that President Xi is correct in identifying those 3 areas. All of them are critically important, not just in the South African economy, but where there's scope for actually building an export base in South Africa to leverage off our own manufacturing capability and export to the rest of the continent. As I said, in the case of energy, it's a critical issue. For decades, we've had the largest integrated energy system in the world, but supply has not kept up with demand, unfortunately. And the just transition, and we need to talk about the just transition, is an absolutely essential driver for all countries, and in particular for South Africa, where we try and decarbonize our economy without inflicting a huge damage on the very many jobs that are potentially at risk as we move away from, in particular, a coal-based economy to others. China can be of considerable assistance there. In the case of agriculture and agro-industry, Africa has enormous potential, not just South Africa, but the continent, in terms of the consumption and indeed the processing and export of agricultural product. Thus far, we've not managed to achieve the potential that exists. Once again, enormous scope for China and Africa, indeed via South Africa, inter alia, to collaborate. And then finally, in manufacturing, perhaps the last point I'd make in this regard is that we all recognized during COVID, during lockdown, not just in South Africa, but elsewhere, how dependent we were on importing goods from elsewhere for a functioning economy, and how important it was to see to what extent we could develop our own localization capability, let alone the benefits that accrue. Vaccination programs are one very good example of that, where Africa was almost entirely dependent upon the importation of vaccines from elsewhere in the world, rather than having its own continental vaccination manufacturing capability. That is now being addressed. In fact, President Ramaphosa is leading and spearheading the work for and on behalf of the African Union there. Once again, I have absolutely no doubt that China can play a significant role. And I want to just emphasize what I said before, which is that a focused, disciplined approach on bilateral as well as multilateral relations lies at the heart of this, building trust, confidence, and relations between individuals, between institutions, and indeed between countries. And that, of course, is in part what President Xi Jinping has been referring to in his article.
Yeah. I really agree with your point in terms of building a stronger industrial export base, Martin, not just for South Africa, but for the entire African continent as well, because we know if we see more investment in manufacturing, for example, in new energy production plants, these are about high-paying quality jobs. This is about higher value-added industries that can create more jobs and help countries modernize and industrialize, and Africa can definitely see more industrialization as well. Ashraf, I want to come to you again, coming back to a bigger picture. We talk about BRICS as amplifying the voices of the global South, but is there an argument to be made that if we see stronger South-South cooperation, that's actually good for the global North too? It's good for advanced economies that we see more robust markets in the global South.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. I mean, when we come and talk about amplifying the voices of the South, we've always been very vocal. There is no doubt about it. I mean, we've been screaming for decades. The problem is who's been listening. And if the North has been listening, they obviously misinterpreted, our voices. And I think what the BRICS brings to the table is a platform for not only our voices to be heard, but for people to listen to them, and most importantly, for people to interpret them in the right manner, that this continent, or the South in general, developing nations, have a great future, that still need to go through, again, sophistication, maturity of their economies, which the North have already done for their own reasons over the past centuries. And I think now is the opportunity for the South to be able to lead the global economy, because, as I mentioned before, we are in adverse circumstances, and no one half of this continent will be able to lead the future of this globe. There has to be some kind of cohesion between the South and the North. And once again, joining BRICS or not, or any other bloc, does not become exclusive. Because in all reality, I mean, a country like Egypt and, the African continent as well, and a lot of the developing nations we still have very strong ties with the North. We still have, let's not call it dependency, but we do have very strategic approaches with these countries, and they still influence a lot of the what we call investment and business. The point is, how dependent are you on these countries for them to be able to actually influence you beyond how we want to be influenced or what we want to do in the future? And I think BRICS brings that, cohesion between the South, makes our voices heard, and people listen, and then it becomes interpreted in the right manner.
Yeah. Professor Liu, I want to give you the final question and just to wrap it up for us, because look, we can call it a BRICS grouping, but President Xi Jinping has specifically said that this is not an exclusive club. Right? This is about win-win. This is about mutual cooperation. There's no ideologies here. We're focusing on common areas of development. How do we raise living standards for the peoples of our countries? So do you think the BRICS grouping, whatever it may be called in the future when more members join in, is this a new model for global cooperation going forward?
Well, there's a huge potential for them to grow into that type of more institutionalized framework, in that the mean is inclusivity and the goal is sustainability. So this is really ring the ear to many of those countries and people and even business community, and the fact that President Xi actually 3 years ago, he introduced the China-African the social responsibility. The community from the Chinese investors, they are really taking full into shape. And so now with more members to join it, so the primary importance is finance, because without finance, no infrastructure, no energy can really be developed. So this is already a very good beginning, from the BRICS Bank and together with the contingency fund. And the other is, the trade and investment. I think now they do not really have to create a totally brand new and distinctive, set of rules, but it's like the CPTPP. They can draw on existing rules like WTO, like International Labor Organizational treaties, and etc., so that they can get further consolidated. And now, with Africa, they can really join as the cross-border type of collaboration, and for example, their continental free trade area, and Latin America, they have the Mercosur, etc. So the integration program can be further consolidated, so that they are there to support a collaborative structure. So with certain rules to play, and to draw the existing strengths of many of the global institutions, and also the rule of norms, etc., so that they can really have a promise to shape themselves as something that is very powerful, that can even rival as OECD, and also in finance, rival with the Paris Club, and something that's really a breakthrough of the BRICS, as I say.
Yeah. Well, the majority of the world's population still live in developing countries. So I guess the BRICS grouping and an expanded BRICS Plus, hopefully can find more synergies, amplify those synergies between developing economies, and that can contribute, I guess, to global stability.
And also they can have collective voice.
A collective voice.
Their common interests.
Of common interests. Yes. So hopefully we can see more of that global economic stability as the developing countries, the global South, comes together in quite an uncertain world that we live in right now. Okay, fascinating discussion. Many thanks so much for your thoughts on this, Professor Liu, and our thoughts also to Ksenia, Martin, and Ashraf. And that's going to do it for this edition of our BRICS Roundtable here on BizTalk. I'm Michael Wang in Beijing. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.